So welcome back to my channel again. This time it's again a battle report of Flames of War, so the Second World War oriented historic wargaming system. I'm playing against a friend who brought his German Panzergrenadierkompanie. So I'm playing with my British, with a Canadian armored squadron. The Canadians are counted as British in this game. So they have, it's an armored force. I mostly have Shermans. I have a couple of Fireflies in there. Basically these are upgunned Shermans. And I have a motor platoon, and that's my infantry in the list. I have an armored car platoon to do some scouting. And otherwise it's just Shermans really. My opponent has the Panzergrenadiers, so that's an infantry force. He has 3 platoons of Panzergrenadiers with a lot of Panzergrenadier squads, and each of those squads are composed out of 2 infantry stands, so there's a total of 18 Panzergrenadier stands, and then 3 Panzergrenadier platoon command stands. And then he also has some mortars to support this, and he still has some tank support, so he has 3 Panther Gs and he has 2 Sturer Emils. So the Sturer Emils, those are really they are the heaviest guns that you can get in the game, I think. They were released as a mid-war monster, so in the sense that with Flames of War you can either play during the start of the war in early war, in the middle of the war in mid-war, or at the end of the war in late war. In late war you have all the exciting little bits and tools, so usually tournaments go for late war because it's more exciting. But yeah, the Sturer Emils officially was content for mid-war, but my opponent just brought them because he thought they were really cool looking models. And he doesn't always get to put them on the table. Well, so otherwise the list, the Panther Gs are already really well-rounded tanks, with a very decent frontal armor and a really decent gun. And the Sturer Emils, they basically trade their armor to amp up the gun even more. I mean, the gun of the Panther against Shermans is already kind of overkill, but the Sturer Emils are definitely overkill against my Shermans. But my opponent, he expected actually to have to face my elephants. I didn't know what I was facing either, but I just went for my Shermans. And it turned out to be quite a reliable force. So I like it in Flames of War that even just normal tanks like Shermans, that they can still be competitive. So for the mission, Flames of War uses a lot of different missions, and the goal in Flames of War is not necessarily to get points of your opponents or to cripple his platoons. It's one way to win the game, but usually the games are won through the objectives, and usually it's a polar battle in the sense that the missions for both players are not equal. So polarized, that is, sorry. So in this case I have an armored squadron, my opponent has an infantry squadron, so it's assumed that the armor is going to attack the infantry. There's also some lists where the infantry then get to attack the tanks, but usually with normal armies, let's say, the armor is always the attacker against the infantry. And I'm gonna have to break through my opponent's lines. So my opponent is basically allowed to deploy in the bottom left corner and in the top right quarter. I instead get the top left corner and I have to go to the bottom right one. So on the bottom right you see these 2 rectangular shapes. Those are my 2 objectives. If I start my turn on an objective without any opposing team within 10 centimeters of it, I win the game. And my opponent wins if this does not happen by turn 8 or so, I think. And that's it. So some other things still worth considering is that in Flames of War you also play with some reserves, so not all of your forces are going to start on the table. And this is universally for any army that you play. So you don't have to buy specifically units with ambush rules or anything. Just in the version we're playing, I had to put still 2 platoons, I believe, in reserves because of the mission. My opponent had mobile reserves, meaning that he could only deploy one single tank platoon on the table. So he chose to have the Sturer Emils on table and put the Panthers in reserve. Otherwise, he was allowed to have the entirety of his force on table. The objectives are actually in a location on the table where he is not allowed to deploy, so this is why he has the rightmost infantry platoon lined up to go defend the rightmost objective, and on the bottom you can see another infantry platoon that's going to go for the other objective. Then he uses the last infantry platoon to box me in a little bit. This is quite essential because otherwise I can just move up and just shoot his Sturer Emils just where they are. And now, while at a distance longer than 40 centimeters, you get a -1 to hit. So this does protect his Sturer Emils a little bit from incoming fire. Because the way it works in Flames of War is that you don't actually hit on your own skill rating at a target, but you actually use the skill rating of your target to see how well you can hit them. This has the philosophy that by the time that the Second World War happened, the skill of the crew and the skill of just the troops themselves was more influential in preventing hits from occurring rather than the skill of the person wielding the gun. So just as a quick introduction into how this works, in this case we are playing with veteran troops. They are normally hit on a 4+. If they're concealed, you go to 5+. If they're also more than 40 centimeters away, you go to 6+. And if you concealed and you didn't do anything on your own turn, so didn't move and didn't shoot, you also go to ground, raising it to a 7+, making it impossible for the opponent to hit you. And this is the deployment that we ended up with. As you can see, my opponent has built up quite a defensive line, and yeah, I basically just set up everything for an opportunity to get some shots off first turn. I think I actually misplayed in this setup, but you'll see this also during the first turn. So off we go. The attacker has the first turn in this specific scenario, at least. So I basically set up with my deployment tanks to be able to shoot at my opponent. My recce is able to remove the gun to ground of my opponent, so I hit him on 5+ if I'm within 40 centimeters and 6+ if I'm far away. British troops have a special rule on their tanks that if they're more than 40 centimeters away and didn't move, they get to reroll to hit. So usually this is on 6s at veterans, but with 2 shots per tank, rerolling to hit, 4 6s to hit, basically doubles your rate of fire. So that is a really good way to make it more efficient for British troops to shoot. And here you can right now see my mistake that I did in the first turn. So these we both have air support. My air support did not arrive in my first turn, I believe, or didn't do anything influential at least. My opponent's aircraft also showed up, and you could see him position the template over my troops. So aircraft use templates in Flames of War, and you just look at the troops that are under the template and they are potentially going to get hit by the aircraft. Normally you should spread out your tanks, most importantly tanks, a little bit, just to mitigate the damage that you take from incoming aircraft. I, in this example, did not do this. So, yeah, as you can see, my opponent only has a thin line of troops, basically. I could have very easily just deployed on the right side of my deployment, go through the hedge that's in the middle of the field. Then I have an open ground over which I can just freely move towards the objective. But I thought that with my 8 tanks, I might be able to thin out my opponent's lines quick enough in order to be able to go in and just push through and get rid of these the Sturer Emil. The good thing is that if my opponent decides to fire, I couldn't hit his Sturer Emils on my turn because they were gone to ground, they were concealed, they were more than 40 centimeters away in veterans. But if he shoots, he's no longer gone to ground, so I can hit him on 6s. My tanks that can see him are gonna hit on 6s, and they have a reroll to hit because I will probably not move with them. So once he shoots, and he's going to hit me on 6s also because I'm a veteran, I'm concealed and I'm far away. Once he shoots, it's going to be really easy for me to hit him back. So I definitely, on my first turn, should have just moved to the right, and just tempted him to shoot at me. My second turn, I decide to stay put. I actually forget about my opponent's aircraft just being there, so that was also a bit of a mistake. My aircraft does show up, and I can target my opponent's infantry, and that is that's something quite valuable. So normally, if you have like a full template that you can lay on a unit of infantry, there's bound to be some kills. In this case, my opponent did save his infantry pretty well. So in Flames of War, the ammunition you carry is also really variable depending on the troops that you have. So for example, a tank shooting at another tank can be rather effective because he has a high anti-tank value. If you have an anti-tank value that's lower than your opponent's armor, then you have no chance whatsoever to damage your opponent's tank. And against infantry, any weapon is as effective. Just infantry have a 3-up save, an unconditional 3-up save that just saves them from harm. And then if they're dug in, you have to make a firepower test. And this is where machine guns differ from main guns. Like the tank cannon has a 3-up firepower, a machine gun has a 6-up firepower, meaning that usually with a main gun it's more effective to dig out troops that have dug in. Yet if you want to make sure that they just keep their heads down and stay pinned down, then machine guns are the way to go. Yeah, that's a bit of a short introduction of how weapons generally work in Flames of War. My opponent got his second airstrike, and he managed to put it on my right side of Shermans, which I definitely should have moved away from there. And by now in my third turn I decide to move them away because, as you can see on the recording, he just destroyed 4 of my tanks in one go. This aircraft was really devastating. And I was kind of getting worried now. I mean, I did manage to get 1 Sturer Emils of my opponent down, but I'm not really putting on any pressure or pushing for the objective yet. So this might become a really tough battle. I decide to go in with my tanks into his anti-tank infantry, just because I don't really have any other choice. But to rush a bit more. And this is a nice aspect of Flames of War. Like, if you have sufficient time, if you have unlimited time, then the attacker has quite a fair shot at beating the defender. But there is some time constraints in terms of turns that play a role here. So first of all, my opponent has reserves that arrive earlier than my reserves. And, well, depending on dice rolls, it's either in the first, second, or third turn that he will get a single platoon. And I only start rolling from my third turn on 4 reserves, so it might very well be that only on my turn 5 I get my reserves. Yeah, but in the end, the time is kind of expressed in the turns, and I have to be at an objective before turn 6, I believe, and yeah, time was of the essence. And my opponent's turn, my opponent does get his Panther support, and I think in this scenario he did misjudge where my strengths were going to be, because his options for the Panthers were to deploy them either in the bottom left or in the top right. In the top right I have my second in command going towards his infantry. So that would have been a really juicy target, and also my reserves are still going to go on to arrive on table. My reserves will likely just go for the objective as soon as they can, depending on when they will arrive from reserves, obviously. But in the spot where he just currently placed his Panthers, they don't have any overwatch on the objectives, whilst if he had deployed them on the top right, he could have had way better view lines to defend his own objectives. And also, I think in terms of priorities, my reserves were a higher priority for him right now than my actual battle line. So this scenario is a bit of a funny one, because it's a breakthrough and your reserves, they actually arrive just right at the objective. But for a lot of armies, it's also really beneficial to just really break through the enemy lines. And the variety in armies that you can get in Flames of War is really, really big. So there are some standard armies or standard guidelines to different factions. Like normally, if you were to face Russians in a breakthrough, it's gonna be a hell of a struggle, because they just flood the field with infantry stands, and you just don't have the amount of turns that you need. Or you cannot make the distance that you want in the amount of time that you in the amount of turns that you need to do so. So also against some armies, it might be really nice to just put a lot of stuff in reserves and try to attack from behind. Against others, it might be really worthwhile to just boost through. I mean, with the Germans, you can also make a list where you just have 4 Jagdtigers. Those are basically the Sturer Emils, but then with a closed top. So they're not open top, so they're really well armored also. If you field 4 of these guys, then you can just field 1 more infantry platoon and some guns, and then you're done. Then your opponent can just rush through your lines, because tanks normally are not allowed to come within 5 centimeters of infantry unless they go into assault. But tanks versus tanks, you can just drive by a tank, and it cannot prevent you from doing so in any way. So if my opponent only had like 4 tanks on the table, I could just have moved through his tanks to the objective, just stand on both objectives and just go like, yeah, what are you gonna do now? Yeah. So that was just to say that there's a huge variety in the armies of Flames of War. Yeah, what happened in my 4th turn is that I got both of my reserves, so I both got my motor platoon and I did get my last tank platoon. That was really good for me, because then the motor platoon could assault first into his infantry. I lost a couple of stands there, but I made my opponent also lose a couple of stands. Unfortunately, I lost my entire motor platoon doing this, but then the tanks could later go in, and they could just annihilate the rest of his platoon, forcing his other infantry platoon, to come to my objective that I was contesting now. So if he doesn't do anything about the 4 Sherman tanks that are now holding the objective, then the game's over and I have won. He still had 1 mortar guy that was there that could have moved there if he hadn't been pinned, but he was pinned. So unfortunately, he couldn't move, because you can't move closer to the enemy once you're pinned down. And at the start of your turn, you make a check to see if you're still pinned down for the rest of the turn. He failed the check, so he was still pinned down. Also, what can happen in Flames of War is that you lose the commander of your platoon. If you do so, then you also cannot move until you get a new commander appointed by the first or the second in command. But I think that's actually an archaic rule from version 3, and now with version 4 they really streamlined a lot of the rules to make it a bit of a more accessible and easy game to get into, at least. So they went from a rulebook of like 250 pages with a lot of exceptions to a rulebook of like 60 or 70 pages, which still seems daunting, but once you get the mechanics in good grip, then it really plays easily and really smoothly. Like I play Flames of War, I think once every 2 months or so, and I also played it really intensively for a period of time, and even going to the ETC with Flames of War. So I did know my rules really, really well, and I can now I feel like my grasp of the rules has worsened, but still, it works really smoothly still. Most of the rules are rather self-explanatory, and there's just some details that are more difficult to keep track of, but you can always also easily find it in the rules. So my opponent, he tries to knock me off the objective with his infantry. He has a full capacity of dealing with tanks with his infantry. Unfortunately, he doesn't manage to take out a lot of my tanks. I make my motivation test to counter-assault, so I counter-assault him. He doesn't make his motivation test, so he has to break off. He has to go away from the objective with his infantry. So that results in me starting my turn with my tanks on the objective without any enemy contesting it. So it's a win for the British. In the end, it turned out to be quite a close game because I was also at the break point of my company, meaning that if I lost another platoon, I would have to start for my company morale. So that is to see if your entire company maybe just runs away because they don't believe in the greater good anymore. But as it was, I did manage to squeeze out a win there, even though it was a really close game. I'd like to thank my opponent for the game, and well, hopefully we can make a lot more videos like this. For now, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you soon.